12 men stood inside a mountain tunnel with wooden blocks forced between their teeth so that guards would not have to hear their final words, while a steel crane slowly lifted each man into the air by a rope tied around his neck. Thousands of starving prisoners stood in rows and were forced to watch every second of it happen. This scene took place again and again inside a network of tunnels carved into a mountain called the Konstein near the German town of Nordhausen, where enslaved men were forced to build the world's first long-range ballistic missile for a regime that valued a weapon more than the lives of the people building it. The chain of events that created this underground factory began in the middle of August 1943, when British bombers carried out a night raid code named Operation Hydra against the German Rocket Research Center at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, destroying much of the facility, killing several scientists, and also killing hundreds of forced laborers who had been housed nearby. Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler concluded that rocket production could never again sit exposed on the surface where Allied aircraft could reach it, so the decision was made within days to move the entire manufacturing operation underground into a set of old tunnels owned by a state fuel storage company that had been dug years earlier into gypsum and anhydrite rock beneath the Konstein. Reichsfuhrer Himmler placed an SS general named Hans Kammler in charge of the new underground project. Kammler was an engineer by training and had built his reputation constructing camps and industrial sites at extraordinary speed with no regard for the cost and human suffering. He was given command of the labor force needed to expand the tunnels into a functioning missile factory, and he pursued the assignment with a level of ruthlessness that alarmed even some of his fellow officers. By the end of August 1943, roughly 200 prisoners had been transferred from the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp to begin work at the site. Within days, Kammler ordered more than 1,000 additional prisoners brought in, and soon hundreds were arriving every single day. The camp that grew up around the tunnel entrances was given the codename Dora. The complex itself consisted of 2 enormous parallel tunnels, each stretching more than a mile through the mountain and connected by dozens of smaller cross-tunnels branching off to either side. For the first several months of its existence, the camp had no barracks at all. Prisoners lived inside the tunnels themselves, sleeping on bare stone floors, covered with a thin layer of straw stacked on wooden bunks 4 levels high in some sections. The air underground stayed cold year-round, hovering just below 60 degrees, and thick with stone dust kicked up by constant blasting and drilling that coated the lungs of every man working there. There was no running water and no functioning toilets, so prisoners relieved themselves in open barrels that were rarely emptied and overflowed regularly. Daily rations amounted to little more than a small piece of bread and a bowl of thin watery soup, even though prisoners were pushed through work shifts lasting 12 hours, swinging pickaxes and jackhammers, and hauling broken rock out by handcart. Dysentery and typhus spread rapidly through the packed tunnels carried by lice and contaminated water, and men too weak or sick to keep working were frequently loaded onto transports and sent away to be killed outright at Auschwitz-Birkenau or Mauthausen rather than be allowed to recover. Many of the men arriving were already sick and malnourished from earlier time spent in other camps, and the combination of exhaustion, starvation disease, and constant beatings by guards and prisoner overseers known as kapos produced a death rate higher than almost any other concentration camp in the entire Nazi system during that period. Close to 3,000 prisoners died in the first 6 months alone, and corpses were routinely stacked outside the tunnel entrances before being hauled away for disposal. New arrivals were typically packed into sealed freight cars for journeys lasting several days with no food, water, or toilet access before reaching Nordhausen and being marched directly to the tunnel entrances, often within hours of stepping off the train. Once inside, men described a deafening constant noise of drilling and blasting echoing off stone walls combined with almost total darkness, broken only by weak electric bulbs strung along the tunnel ceiling, and months would pass before some prisoners saw daylight again. Engineers Arthur Rudolph and Albin Sawatzki were placed in charge of moving equipment from the ruined Peenemünde facility into the new underground plant and getting missile production running as quickly as possible. Rudolph served as operations director and Sawatzki as technical director, and both men pushed prisoners through brutal work schedules to meet production quotas set by Berlin. Chief rocket engineer Werner von Braun visited the site repeatedly during this period, including an extended stay during the harshest weeks of construction in the fall of 1943. Von Braun held an officer's rank inside the SS itself, having joined the organization years earlier at Himmler's urging, and having since been promoted to the rank of major within its ranks, even as he oversaw quality control of missiles built by dying prisoners. He later admitted under oath decades afterward that he had personally witnessed terrible conditions inside the tunnels, though he always denied ever seeing corpses or receiving reports connected to prisoner executions. Rocket components failed constantly during this rush period of construction, and rather than accept that the technology itself was still unreliable, camp authorities frequently blamed prisoners and accused them of deliberate sabotage. Men suspected of sabotage with little or no actual evidence were hanged from cranes at the tunnel entrances as a warning to everyone else forced to keep working underneath their bodies. These hangings were frequently carried out during morning roll call assemblies, where every prisoner in the camp was made to stand at rigid attention in freezing weather, sometimes for hours, until the count was finished and the execution had been completed in full view of the entire camp population. Georg Ricke, who served as general manager of the Mittelbau-Dora company that ran the factory, was later accused by fellow engineers of personally organizing one of these hangings. As 1944 began, conditions slowly changed. Barracks were finally built above ground and prisoners were moved out of the tunnels, which caused the death rate to drop for a period of several months. But the underground factory kept expanding under Kammler's direction, and new satellite camps were established throughout the surrounding Harz region to house additional forced laborers, including camps at Elrich and Harzungen that became known among survivors for conditions even worse than those at the main camp. In October of 1944, the SS made the camp an independent concentration camp in its own right, renamed Mittelbau, and by November of that year, the entire network held more than 32,000 prisoners spread across dozens of subcamps, with over half of them Soviet or Polish nationals, alongside French, Belgian, and other political prisoners, and later a group of Hungarian Jews transferred in from Auschwitz. In March of 1944, Werner von Braun himself was arrested by the Gestapo, along with his brother and two close colleagues after he reportedly made drunken remarks at a private party, suggesting that Germany would likely lose the war, and that his true ambition was to build a vehicle for traveling into space rather than a weapon. Von Braun spent roughly 2 weeks in custody before military officials, including General Walter Dornberger and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, intervened and secured his release by arguing that the rocket program could not continue without him. Himmler reportedly never trusted von Braun again after this incident, but the Army and the Armaments Ministry continued to shield him from further SS interference. Inside the camp, SS officer Hans Moser served as protective custody leader and became one of the most feared men in the entire complex. Survivors later testified that Moser regularly beat prisoners without provocation and took part in hangings, personally shooting men while they were still suspended from the rope, sometimes finishing off victims who were still alive after being taken down. A French resistance fighter named Jean-Michel was arrested and sent to Dora during this period, where he survived the underground construction phase and later wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of daily life inside the tunnels, describing men collapsing at their posts from exhaustion, while guards forced others to keep working alongside the dead until a shift ended. By early 1945, the situation deteriorated sharply once again. Waves of prisoners evacuated from camps further east, including Auschwitz and Gross Rosen, arrived at Mittelbau in terrible physical condition, overwhelming the already strained camp and pushing the death toll upward at a pace not seen since the earliest months of construction. New guards transferred in directly from Auschwitz brought an even harsher style of discipline with them, and public executions became more frequent than at any point since the camp first opened. In February of 1945, Himmler replaced Camp Commandant Otto Forschner with Richard Baer, who had previously served as the final commandant of Auschwitz. Between late December and late March, the death toll at the main camp alone reached roughly 5,000, and the crematorium could no longer keep pace, so bodies were burned in open pits instead. On the 1st of April, 1945, work finally stopped inside the Mittelwerk tunnels. 2 days later, Royal Air Force bombers carried out raids on the town of Nordhausen that killed as many as 1,500 prisoners housed at a nearby subcamp called the Bilka Barracks, which had been used to warehouse sick and dying laborers. Camp leadership under Baer began evacuating the remaining prisoners on the 4th of April, sending most by train or on foot, while abandoning several hundred of the sickest prisoners behind in the main camp and at Bilka. The evacuation turned into a series of death marches during which thousands more prisoners died from exhaustion, exposure, and outright execution by guards along the roadside. In one of the worst single incidents of the entire evacuation, more than 1,000 marchers originating from Mittelbau and a neighboring camp were locked inside a large barn near the village of Gardelegen, which guards then set on fire, burning almost everyone trapped inside alive. On the 11th of April 1945, Soldiers from the American 3rd Armored Division and the 104th Infantry Division reached Nordhausen. They had been warned to expect something unusual, but nothing prepared them for what they found. At the Bulka barracks and inside the Dora camp itself, American troops discovered between roughly 1,300 and 2,500 unburied corpses lying alongside a small number of survivors, too weak to stand, who were found lying among the dead. Soldiers photographed the scene extensively, and the images later shocked audiences back home when they were released to the public. Soon afterward, the Americans located the entrances to the underground Mittelwerk tunnels themselves and found rocket parts and assembly equipment still sitting exactly where workers had left them days earlier. When the full accounting was eventually completed, historians estimated that more than 60,000 prisoners from over 20 different nations had passed through the Mittelbau-Dora camp system between 1943 and 1945, and that at least 20,000 of them died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and execution. By comparison, the V-2 rocket itself killed approximately 9,000 people during combat operations against Britain and Belgium, combined roughly 5,000 in Britain and 4,000 across Belgium and other parts of continental Europe. This makes the V-2 the only weapon system in modern history known to have killed more people during its own manufacture than it killed once it was actually used in war. In the war's final weeks, Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and dozens of other engineers who had worked at the Mittelwerk deliberately surrendered to advancing American forces rather than risk capture by the Soviets. Under a secret program that later became known as Operation Paperclip, these men were quietly brought to the United States, where they went on to build American military rockets and eventually the rockets that carried astronauts to the moon during the Apollo program. Georg Ricke was returned to Germany and stood trial in 1947 alongside 18 other defendants in what became known as the Dora trial, held at Dachau, where 15 men were ultimately convicted, and Hans Moser was sentenced to death and executed, while several other camp officials received lesser prison terms. Ricke himself was acquitted and later returned to work in the United States. Decades later, in 1984, American investigators uncovered enough evidence of Arthur Rudolph's direct role in the atrocities at Mittelwerk that he agreed under a legal settlement to permanently renounce his American citizenship and leave the country rather than face formal prosecution, avoiding a public trial for crimes committed 4 decades earlier. In total, roughly 6,000 V-2 rockets were assembled inside the Mittelwerk tunnels between 1943 and 1945 by prisoners who received no benefit whatsoever from the weapon they were dying to produce. Hans Kammler himself vanished during the chaotic final days of the war in early May 1945, and despite years of searching by investigators on multiple continents, his ultimate fate was never conclusively established. The tunnels beneath the Kunstein Mountains still exist today, preserved as part of a memorial site where rusted rocket engines and scattered equipment remain exactly where forced laborers were made to build them under threat of the gallows that once stood at the tunnel entrances.